and then we'll see what Krishna has in store. Well, then we'll have some kirtan, and then we'll really see what Krishna has in store. It's all Krishna's mercy, actually. Don't underestimate Krishna's mercy. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gaurabani Pracharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschyatyade Shatarane Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchakalpaturubhyascha kripa sindhubhya eva cha. Paritanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namah. Right, so Srila Prabhupada's in Los Angeles, and he was just forced to instruct the devotees, from the press, the ISKCON press, about how to, what would you say, how to put his name and title on the books. Actually, what had happened, at least one thing I was told that had happened, was that some of the devotees on the ISKCON press had come under the influence of some of the Gaudiya Math people, and they, of course we don't want to get into it too much, but they, there's a whole history of them not appreciating Srila Prabhupada as much as he deserved. I mean, a few did, but quite a number didn't, and they would sometimes try and minimize Prabhupada. Like Prabhupada, not just at this point it's something 20-something temples, but after some more years, it was 50, 60, 70 or something like that. And his godbrothers all put together had not opened nearly as many at all. And so when one of them was told that, he said, well, he was a businessman. He knew how to organize things. Hare Krishna. So they didn't like him. They really didn't like him being addressed as Prabhupada, and they really didn't like him being addressed as founder Acharya. Okay, so Prabhupada now, well, first of all, we're in chapter 31, a threat against ISKCON. What does this threat against ISKCON mean? Well, it means these types of things. And so now we're going to read about a few of these types of things. I mean, not necessarily like veiled criticisms, but just a lack of seriousness amongst the devotees. Okay, so here we go. At the beginning of the Srimad Bhagavatam class one morning, Prabhupada called on one of the women devotees, Nandarani. And she was a really senior devotee, Nandarani. She was one of the, they're all early ones, but she was one of the early ones. So Nandarani, she stood. She got up, she stood respectfully. Do you chant 16 rounds every day? Well, I try to, Prabhupada. This is the problem, Prabhupada said, turning to the temple president. If Nandarani, one of the senior responsible women, wasn't chanting regularly, then certainly the new women under her weren't either. This was the manager's fault. Yeah, a lot of it's up to the management, particularly the president. You may have heard one GBC member, Badri Narayan Maharaj, he was on a morning walk with Prabhupada, and he had just been made temple president in San Diego, just like a few days before. And he wanted to get some instruction from Prabhupada. So on the morning walk, he asked Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada, what are the duties of the temple president? And Prabhupada responded, temple president means whatever goes wrong, it is your fault. Okay. It's the temple president's fault. All right, so yes. Prabhupada had praised and encouraged his disciples for laboring hard to renovate the temple and for going out daily into the streets to chant and distribute magazines. But for a devotee to not chant the prescribed rounds was to neglect the most important instruction. Has everyone chanted their rounds? Marie? You will. Okay. Okay, right. What Nandarani had not said was that the temple authorities had told her that chanting all her 16 rounds wasn't necessary as long as she worked. They had told her this, even though Prabhupada clearly instructed his disciples at initiation to always chant at least 16 rounds daily. Then another incident. During the morning class, Prabhupada was discussing Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, an associate of Lord Chaitanya. Looking among the devotees, he asked, who can tell me who is Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya? No one spoke. Who can tell us who is Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya? Well done. Okay, anyway, we won't get into it, but we should know who's Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. So no one spoke. Prabhupada waited. None of you, in italics, none of you can tell me who is Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, he asked. One girl raised her hand. She said she had, quote unquote, read something about him. That was all. Aren't you ashamed? Prabhupada looked at the men. You should be the leaders. Now listen to this, everyone, and particularly ladies. Fasten your seat belts. If the men cannot advance, then the women cannot advance. Hare Krishna. You must be Brahmins, then your wives will be Brahmins. But if you are not Brahmins, then what can they do? Unquote. Without improving their chanting and without reading Krishna-conscious literature, Prabhupada said, they would never attain the purity necessary for preaching Lord Chaitanya's message. While the local anomalies were weighing heavily on Srila Prabhupada, he learned of strange things his disciples in India had written in their letters, and he became more disturbed. One letter to devotees in America reported that Prabhupada's godbrothers in India objected to his title Prabhupada. According to them, only Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati should be called Prabhupada, and they referred to Prabhupada as Swami Maharaj. Prabhupada also learned, well, anyway, just on that point, the thing is this, that Prabhupada's name, actually his name, we call him A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, but actually his initiated name as a sannyasi is Swami Maharaj. And the Bhaktivedanta, A.C. Bhaktivedanta, that was there already for years before. But when he was given sannyasi, he was given the name Swami Maharaj. So, in a sense, they can refer to Prabhupada as Swami Maharaj because they're his godbrothers. But the disciples should refer to and address the spiritual master by, it depends. Prabhupada had that, you could say honorific Prabhupada. But otherwise disciples should refer to the spiritual masters as Guru Maharaj, Guru Dev, like this. This is actually correct. Yeah. So anyway, yeah. So, but to object to Prabhupada being called Prabhupada, it's just very narrow-minded. Prabhupada also learned that some of his disciples were saying he was not the only spiritual master. They were interested in reading Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's books as if to discover some new teaching Prabhupada had not yet revealed. Prabhupada regarded these remarks as dangerous for ISKCON. Advancement in spiritual life was based on implicit faith in the spiritual master. And to Prabhupada, these new ideas indicated a relative conception, as opposed to the absolute conception of the spiritual master. For example, also, Srila Prabhupada has set up ISKCON in, essentially the ways we see it set up. GBC body and GBC zones, then temple presidents, sannyasis, and of course, actually the majority of the GBC body are sannyasis, which is as Prabhupada set it up. And sometimes you get devotees, even here in ISKCON, complaining that GBC members shouldn't be There shouldn't be sannyasis. Sannyasis shouldn't be GBC members. And things like that. And really, I mean, just... Anyway, but this is how Prabhupada set it up, personally. Yeah. So, essentially, ISKCON is structured as Srila Prabhupada set it up. If you're familiar with how Prabhupada set it up. Even Tamal Krishna Goswami was a GBC, but then he was a householder. He was married. Then he took sannyas and he withdrew from the GBC. But then Prabhupada instructed him to come back and be a member of the GBC, which he did. So, yeah, we have to be very careful not to, put it in a positive way, we have to be very careful to follow Prabhupada's instructions. Like some devotees, even here in Durban, maybe even in this temple, have ideas about establishing varnashram in this way or that way. But Srila Prabhupada did not really give that sort of instruction. He certainly talked about varnashram to some degree, but not in establishing it like that, like within the temples and things like that. So these are speculations, and they're dangerous, very dangerous. Ultimately, because they undermine the position of Srila Prabhupada, and they may undermine the sort of the vision of that disciples have of their spiritual masters. Right. So to Prabhupada, these new ideas indicated a relative conception, as opposed to the absolute conception of the spiritual master. Such a conception could destroy all he had established. At least it could destroy the spiritual life of anyone who held that conception. Though sometimes ignorant, his disciples, he knew, were not malicious. Yet these letters from India carried a spiritual disease transmitted by several of Prabhupada's godbrothers to his disciples there. Prabhupada had already been troubled when some of his godbrothers had refused to help him secure land in Mayapur, the birthplace of Lord Chaitanya. Although he had asked them to help his inexperienced disciples purchase land, they had not complied. In fact, some of them had worked against him. Prabhupada had written to one of his godbrothers, "I am so sorry to learn that there is a sort of conspiracy by some of our godbrothers as not to give me a place at Mayapur." Prabhupada was sensitive to any threat to ISKCON. His accepting the name Prabhupada, his teaching that the disciple must approach the spiritual master as the direct representative of Krishna without attempting to jump over him to the previous spiritual masters. These things he had carefully explained to his disciples. But now a few irresponsibly spoken remarks in India were weakening the faith of some of his disciples. Perhaps this insidious contamination that was now spreading had precipitated the blunders at ISKCON Press and even the discrepancies in Los Angeles. Talks about the relative position of the spiritual master could only be the workings of Maya, the Lord's illusory energy. Maya was attempting to bewilder the devotees of ISKCON. That was her job, to lead the conditioned souls away from Krishna's service. The recent events began to hamper Prabhupada's writing. He had been working quickly in Los Angeles and had recently finished the second and final volume of Krishna. And on the very tape on which he had dictated the last chapter of Krishna, he had immediately begun a summary of the 11th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam. Gradually, however, his writing stopped. Karanda, Prabhupada's translating would require a great deal of concentration. He would have 2 or 3 of his big Bhagavatam volumes opened up, and sometimes a number of other small books which he would refer to for something or other. He would sit wearing his glasses and speaking into his dictating machine, and he would be completely absorbed in reading. Sometimes he would make a brief note, then look into one of his books, then open another book, turn back to another page, make a note, and then dictate. It required a great deal of concentration. I think that's why Prabhupada did most of it at night, after he would rise from his late evening nap. From 1 or 2 in the morning until 6 or 7 in the morning, he would be absorbed. It was quiet at that time, and he could become absorbed. But when Prabhupada became disturbed about the problems in ISKCON, it inhibited his work. He was spending his time discussing with visiting devotees, or myself, or whoever was there. Then he would spend more time thinking matters over or pondering the problem, and he wouldn't be able to concentrate on his translating. These difficulties disturbed him, and he would think about them and say, I've not been able to concentrate. I've been thinking about this problem. So contact with Prabhupada's godbrothers in the great, at least put it this way, in the very great majority of cases, would tend to produce problems. And even, not always, but more often than not, particularly problems in terms of the disciples' relationships with Prabhupada. Because, like for example, I remember when I mentioned the other night, I think, how it was 1974, I'd already been living in the temple for more than a year. It was probably a year and a half or something. And the then GBC Hansaduta announced one morning at 7 o'clock that we're introducing a new program, which is singing Guru Puja and offering arati to Prabhupada. And it was actually Srila Prabhupada's specific instruction. It wasn't just that some devotees got the idea, it'd be nice to worship Prabhupada more because we owe him so much and like that. It was actually that Prabhupada said to do it. And Prabhupada chose the song. And I remember that day, it was interesting. But some of Prabhupada's godbrothers complained that it was too much focus on the spiritual master. Yeah, because they themselves certainly didn't have enough focus on the spiritual master. yeah, so, therefore in ISKCON and here in Durban, we really try to do it. We really try to keep a focus on Prabhupada. We really try. Of course, I'm sure we can do better also, but we try. And to emphasize sticking with ISKCON, and you could say the standard ideas of how ISKCON functions that were given to us by Prabhupada. And like I mentioned about the Varnashram thing, it's said that Prabhupada said that 50% of my work is not done. That the other 50% which isn't done is establishing Varnashram. But no one knows. There's no record of it. It's just, it's one of those Prabhupada said things, if you're familiar with that idea. Prabhupada said. And Prabhupada sometimes would really get upset when he heard that supposedly he had said something which he hadn't said. Yeah. So, we should keep away from devotees who try to promote ideas, even ISKCON devotees, even if there are some in the temple, devotees who promote ideas which are opposed to the normal ideas that Prabhupada gave and the programs he gave for ISKCON. I'm on a bit of a thing about this at the moment. Yeah. Okay. So just one more paragraph. Although the spiritual master suffers for his disciples' mistakes, Prabhupada's perspective was not simply negative. He continued chanting and lecturing in the temple and inviting the leaders of his movement to visit him in the ideal center of Los Angeles. But he also corrected the diseased mentality wherever it appeared. When, for example, Guru Das wrote from London to say that they had allowed an Indian guest to lecture in the temple while sitting on Prabhupada's Vyasasana. Oh my God, seriously. Prabhupada immediately wrote back, correcting him. I am surprised how you allowed Mr. Parikh to sit on the Vyasasana. Anyway, Hare Krishna. You know that Vyasasana is meant for the representative of Vyasadeva, the spiritual master. But Mr. Parikh does not come in the parampara to become the representative of Vyas. Neither does he have any sound knowledge of Vaishnava principles. I understand from your letter that sometimes discussions on Aurobindo philosophy are done by Mr. Parikh. Are you familiar with Aurobindo philosophy? Good. Believe me. Oh my gosh. It's just a version of Mayavad, that's all. So yeah, sometimes discussions on Aurobindo philosophy are done by Mr. Parikh from the Vyasasana. So I am a little surprised. You get the idea. Prabhupada is understating. A little surprised. He's just shocked, horrified. How did you allow like this? I think you should rectify immediately all these mistakes, as stated by you in the last 2 lines of your letter. I think, in which the devotee Gurudas said, I think the best thing to do is to stop his class. Nonsense ought not to be tolerated. Yes, correct. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada